and gentlemen, put your hands together for Mr. Reggie Summer coming to the stage. Come on now.
Come on, I know y'all gonna get up on this. Get up, get on up, get up, get on up. Stay on the scene, get on up like a sex machine. Come on, London. Get on up, get on up, stay on the scene, get on up like a sex machine. Shake your arm and use your palm. Stay on the scene like a sex machine. All right.
All right, Reggie, you done got on a good foot now.
James always makes me feel good. A cameraman's reflections. The first president I covered with CNN was President Reagan. Now, early in President Reagan's first term, as he was reading the Washington Post newspaper one morning, he came across a story where a black family had moved into a predominantly white neighborhood in Maryland, just a suburb of Washington, D.C. And President Reagan said, this is not right. I want to go and stand with this family. And First Lady Nancy Reagan heard it, and she said, well, I'm going too. So the president, the First Lady, and of course the White House press corps all went out to comfort this family, to support this family. They even talked to the young daughter. And a reporter asked President Reagan, why did you come? And he said, I wanted to stand with this family to show them that the majority of our country supports them and not the person that did this evil act. Now, by definition, the President of the United States is the world's most powerful person. That is until the Queen of England comes to town. On a beautiful sunlit day on the south lawn of the White House, President George H.W. Bush, the first Bush president, welcomed the Queen of England in this beautiful ceremony. President Bush gave a very warm and welcoming speech. And now it was the Queen's turn. So as the Queen approached the presidential podium, it was obvious to everyone, the President, the First Lady, and of course the camera crews, that the podium had been adjusted perfectly for the 6'2" President Bush, but not so much for the 5'4" Queen of England. All you could see behind the podium was this huge purple hat. You could not see the Queen's face, her eyes, nothing. In fact, this speech became known as the speech of the purple hat. Oh. And when it was all over, the British press corps that travels with the Queen from London, they went ballistic. They really let the White House press office have it. And usually when there's a change of speakers, there's somebody that's a staff member with the White House, and they'll press a hidden foot pedal. It's just the podium. You don't even notice it on TV. It just goes down so smooth. But then again, who's going to interrupt the Queen of England? At one point, it looked like President Bush was thinking about it. He took a small step forward, and then he took that same step back. Not going to do it. Wouldn't be prudent. So the British press corps, they started yelling at all the American camera crews, like we had something to do with it. And they started saying stuff like, God save the Queen! God save the Queen! Like it was some kind of battle cry or something. And of course, in true American fashion, we yell right back, oh yeah? Oh yeah? You all always remember when we used to call Bill Clinton America's first black president. Remember that? Civil rights activist Al Sharpton once said about President Clinton, he's the only politician, black or white, that knows all the words to lift every voice and sing. Wow. Now come on, it's a great song, but you know, we don't know that song. One of the most iconic images from September 11th took place when President George W. Bush, second Bush president, stood on the still smoldering rubble of New York City and with that bullhorn said, to the people that did this, you'll hear from us soon. Well, to me, just as powerful a moment, President Bush drove out to a mosque in Virginia, 20 miles from the White House. And President Bush stood with the Muslim community and its leaders and said, Islam is peace. And the Muslim community loves America just as much as I do. It was a very powerful moment. President Barack Obama. Sometimes I just like saying his name. I miss him too. This story is based on a conversation I had with President Obama. And at the time, he was Senator Obama, but we all knew he was the chosen one. He was going to be president. So every time President Obama, or Senator Obama, I should say, would give a press conference on Capitol Hill, everybody in the press corps would come because we had convinced ourselves that any moment he was going to announce that he was running for president of the United States. And this particular assignment was no different. It was taking place at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., just around the corner from the White House. And the place was packed. And Obama gave his usual speech of hope and inspiration. It was beautiful. And I packed my gear away, and as I'm heading to the exit, I said to myself, I think I just filmed the next president of the United States. So I get to the freight elevator, and that's like a little shortcut that all the camera crews that will do an event at the National Press Club would take, because it takes you right down to the first floor, no waiting. And just as the elevator door is about to close shut, I hear that unmistakable voice. Young man, can you hold that door? I turn around, it's Barack Obama. So of course I put my leg, my foot, everything. I am not going to let that door close. So he gets in with his staff, and he sees, obviously, that I'm a cameraman with all the gear. And he says, how did you think my speech went? Wait a minute, what? You're asking me how do I think your speech went? Barack Obama will go down as one of America's greatest presidents and one of the world's greatest speakers. But when he asked that question, it was with such humility and sincerity, not an ounce of sarcasm. Now, you know how we're all supposed to have this really great elevator speech just in case the moment comes up? Well, I had one that day too, but it was real short. I said, I thought your speech was wonderful. And he said, tell your boss at CNN, I said to give you a raise. And everybody laughed. And he got off the elevator and walked into history. But a true close call for me happened on September 11th. My assignment that day was to film Michael Jordan's announcement that he was coming out of retirement and he was going to play for our Washington Wizards basketball team. That was going to be the biggest news story on September 11th. So my partner James and I, we get our gear and we go around the streets of Washington to get the reaction of Washingtonians talking about the greatest basketball player ever is going to play for our home team. So we got about a dozen or so people, and I took my tape back to CNN to be played later on the Wolf Blitzer show. And I go up to the CNN newsroom to watch the monitors just to see what's going on around the world. And all of a sudden, I saw a plane crash into World Trade Center in New York. Thank you. And at first, we all thought it was an accident. Perhaps a small plane got off course. And then moments later, a second plane crashed into the second tower. America was under attack. This was no accident. So I was told to take my video camera up to Capitol Hill just as a precaution. As dramatic as the two planes crashing into the Twin Towers was, we thought it was just isolated to New York City. I'm now standing on the steps of the U.S. Capitol when all of a sudden I hear a loud crash followed by a plume of black smoke. It was that third plane crashing into the Pentagon. Now our nation's capital was under attack. And all of a sudden, a U.S. Capitol police officer runs towards me and says, "Get away from the Capitol, get away from the Capitol." A fourth plane is coming for us now. Well, I'm not ashamed to say a fear came over me that day, that moment that I had never felt before in my life. But I'd been a cameraman since I was 19 years old, started in my hometown of Birmingham, Alabama. All I knew was filming the news. So I point my camera to the sky, I pan over to the Capitol, I pray, and then I run. And out of nowhere, I thought of my father one Friday night when I was 15 years old. And he said, Reggie, tomorrow's Saturday. We're going to get up bright and early so you can go practice parallel parking, so you can take your driving test. Later on that Friday night, my father died in my arms of a sudden heart attack. He didn't make it to Saturday. And I always think of the phrase, my life flashes before me. We say that all the time when we can't find our keys for a couple hours, or God forbid we lose our cell phone. Well, mine actually did. As I'm running and praying and filming, I thought of my family, my lovely wife, Sandy, who's in the audience tonight. And our two beautiful daughters, Kate and Regina. And I prayed, God, please do not take me from them. And I later found out by talking to a therapist that it's a natural reaction of your mind, your body, and your soul. They all start to shut down when you think you're going to draw your last breath on this earth. Or as my CNN reporter that day, Kate Snow, who's now at NBC doing a great job, said with tears in her eyes, how far do I have to run to live? Because if a 757 crashes in front of you, there are no survivors. And if you get a chance to see the CNN documentary, America Remembers, you'll hear my voice yelling for people to stay away from the Capitol. Run, stay away from the Capitol. Because this is before Twitter and social media, and I wanted to warn as many people as I could. And as I'm running and praying, my dear mother flashed right before me. Mrs. Willie Lee Selma. She lived to be 90 years old. My mother was the strongest person I ever met in my life. And it took a year of my sister Frida and I, who she lives in Washington as well, of begging and pleading with my mother to leave our hometown of Birmingham and move to Washington so she could be near us, because she had gotten older and the house was too big. And about a month before September 11th, she said yes. And the thought of my mother, who's now living in Washington, D.C., the thought of somebody walking in my mother's house saying, your baby boy, and that was a little nickname she had for me. I was the youngest out of 3 sons. Someone telling her that her baby boy was not coming home, ever. Well, that just about broke me. That just about broke me. And I'm kind of disoriented and my eyes are full of water. And my producer, Ted Barry, said, well, what do you think we ought to do now? And I said, Ted, I don't know. I think we are all sitting ducks, because everywhere on Capitol Hill is a symbol of America. The Capitol that's now behind us, the Supreme Court, the highest office in the land in front of us, right next door, the Library of Congress that houses some of our country's most precious artifacts. Everything a terrorist would want to destroy. And then a voice said, run behind the Supreme Court. There's a street that leads from the Supreme Court. So I turned to my crew, my friends, and I said, let's run to the Supreme Court, to the rear entrance. And I am running, and I stopped dead in my tracks. And now I know why that voice told me to run behind the Supreme Court. About 200 feet in front of us is a small church. I see that church and I say, let's run to the church. Let's run to the church. We run to that church. And in front of the church is a cross made out of 2 steel beams. I go over to that cross and I rub that cross with everything I have. And I turn to my friends and I say, nothing is going to happen to us today. We are going to survive. My father, he's a Baptist minister. He used to call it that old rugged cross. And I rubbed that cross. And as we now know, that 4th plane did not crash into Capitol Hill because of the bravery and the courage of the heroes, the passengers on Flight 90. They steered that plane away from Washington, and they crashed their own plane, saving our lives, but into an open field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Just imagine the courage of that thought process, knowing that you're going to overpower the terrorists, you're going to steer that plane away from Washington, D.C., but you're going to crash your own plane into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Now, standing here in London, England, I would be remiss if I did not also honor the 70 British citizens who also died on 9/11 in New York City in the Twin Towers. They brought to America their passion and their expertise. And one such Brit was Gavin Gushney. Gavin loved America so much, upon graduating from university, he became a U.S. citizen. America and Great Britain share a common bond. As Winston Churchill once said, a special relationship. And speaking of special, I want to thank Vanessa McLean and the beautiful people, all these phenomenal women, as Maya Angelou would call you all, for allowing me the opportunity to speak on a global stage with the Speakers Institute for Women. God bless you all.